remember that day too clearly to consider it just a routine workday. We were sitting in the control room of the Gliese 94A station, and everything was running on the usual schedule: boring reports, endless calibrations, and the coffee machine that was jammed again. Then suddenly, a crackle, not just static, but a kind of rhythm. At first, I thought it was some stupid prank, but when the spectral analysis produced a repeating structure, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Strange vibrations echoed in the speakers, as if someone was trying to hum a tune through 1,000 years of silence. An old radio signal. We amplified the amplitude, and through the hissing, as if cutting through cosmic dust, human voices broke through. A song, real, emotional, imperfect, but alive. I didn't know then that it would become the most unsettling discovery of my life. We were used to dead space, to cold data and infinite emptiness, but here, an echo of a civilization that no longer exists. Sounds that came from the distant past, from those we once called a legend, humans. We sat in silence until the frequencies died down. No one was joking, although usually we couldn't go without sarcasm. The chief astrolinguist later said that it wasn't just random radio interference. He claimed the signal structure was too meaningful, as if someone had deliberately broadcast the song, knowing it would be heard someday. The signal's age was over 8,000 standard years. I couldn't comprehend it. 8,000 years. While our species was just learning to synchronize antennas, the humans had already vanished, but their music was still wandering the vacuum. The station council decided an expedition had to be sent. A chance like this would never come again. And honestly, I didn't volunteer out of curiosity. I wanted to see if they truly existed. These gods from the blue planet, as the ancient chronicles called them. I wanted to understand what a species capable of leaving behind music instead of themselves felt like. Our ship, the Aurelia, was not built for heroic missions, more for tedious research flights and endless reports back to the center. But when we were assigned the task of flying to the signal source, the atmosphere sharply changed. We suddenly became part of something bigger, almost mythical. The journey took 3 cycles. We flew through dead systems where stars had already faded, and I caught myself fearing the moment of arrival. Not that we wouldn't find life, but that we would find the truth, and it would be scarier than the void. Sometimes we'd play that signal in the background. Everyone listened, some even tapped their feet, and every time I noticed, everyone got a strange look, a mixture of nostalgia and anxiety. The music made us vulnerable. It felt as if it remembered more than we did. When we entered the system where Earth was supposed to be, the instruments showed only a cloud of dust and a few chunks of orbital debris. At first, I thought it was a navigation error, but then the sensors picked up a faint gravitational distortion, the remnants of a planet. What was once called the cradle of humanity was now a gray shard rotating among its own shadows. We found the spot where the signal was strongest. There, on the scorched surface, stood a metallic structure, partially destroyed, but still holding its shape. A radio antenna. Real. We landed nearby, and I swear, when I first stepped onto its dusty pad, it felt like the air still held the vibration of the old melody. Everything was dead, but in that deadness, there was a sense of presence. We began the investigation. No cities remained, only shadows, reliefs that looked like gigantic scars. One of the engineers found an underground vault, protected even after thousands of years. Inside, metallic boxes with symbols, strange data crystals, children's drawings. One showed a figure of a person standing under the stars, with a hand outstretched toward something huge and bright. I didn't know that I would be moved by a drawing made by a creature that went extinct millennia ago. But it was like a personal message. Look, we were here. Later we deciphered part of the archives. Humans knew the end was near. Climate, wars, epidemics, all at once. But it seems that in their final days, they weren't silent. They sang. And it was this song that became their final signal. Not a plea for rescue, but a farewell. I didn't immediately grasp how terrifying Earth looked from the blackness of space when you see it for the first time after humanity vanished. We were used to historical images. The blue sphere, a symbol of life, home, the cradle. Advertising banners once called it the jewel of the solar system. But when our ship finally reached orbit and I saw it with my own eyes, I felt not awe, but a strange, heavy sensation, as if I was looking not at a planet, but at an abandoned era, frozen in the void. Continents were blurred by brownish-gray patches, huge areas looked scorched, and in some places, the oceans had taken on a morbid, rusty hue. Atmospheric storms spiraled into abnormally dense formations, as if someone had once tried to cover the earth with a blanket of toxic clouds. I caught myself thinking that I had expected something more heroic, dramatically ruined, yet preserving the structure of a civilization. Instead, I saw a planet that looked like it had been forgotten to be turned off after the apocalypse, and this sense of abandonment felt heavier than any ruin. We began an orbital scan, and as the equipment processed the data, it became clear. Nature had tried to reclaim the surface, but something was hindering it. Too many toxic zones, dead areas where life could have regenerated but didn't. In some regions, cities remained, but they looked strange. Not destroyed, not erased, but as if embalmed. Almost all of them were covered with a thick layer of frost, even those previously in warmer latitudes. Inside, the instruments registered residual energy, as if something in the buildings was still drawing power, although the source should have long since run dry. I tried to explain this with surviving autonomous systems designed to last for centuries, but deep down, I knew. It was too bizarre even for past technologies. And the closer we got to the surface, the more a persistent thought hammered in my brain. Earth didn't just die. It seemed to be clinging to the past while simultaneously trying to hide it. We chose a landing point, an old scientific communication station whose coordinates matched the location where the old radio signal with the song had once been amplified. In the documents, it was listed as an International Deep Space Listening Center, one of the last projects that continued operating even after the planet's crisis began. I looked at its outlines flashing on the screen, the dome, the antennas, the long blocks of laboratories, and I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if I was being warned not to go down there. But we had no choice. It was the only place we could get information from. When the landing gear touched the ground, I thought I would hear a sound, a crunch, a scrape, anything. But there was nothing. A complete, monstrous silence, so dense that it felt like sound had died here along with life. I exited the airlock and took my first breath of Earth's air, filtered by the suit. It wasn't air, but a mixture of ash, cold, and unsettling memories. Everywhere around the station lay the debris of the past, transport capsules, rusty instruments, pieces of hull plating, as if they had prepared for an evacuation here, but never made it. I moved forward, monitoring my suit's readings, and only then noticed that the snow covering the station wasn't snow. It was fine, powdery ash, mixed with metallic particles, as if the atmosphere itself had spent years grinding up technical objects and spewing this gray dust back onto the ground. Inside the station, it was cold and empty, but everything was strangely positioned as if work had been interrupted only a minute ago. Tables were cluttered with tools, terminals displayed extinguished interfaces, and cups that once held coffee lay on the floor. I caught myself with a ridiculous thought. I felt like an uninvited guest in a house where everyone had left but promised to return. And that feeling turned out to be far more frightening than all our scientific reports and calculations. When I realized this, something inside me broke. I had always laughed at the idea that ancient species could be more enlightened, but those voices, there was something in them that we don't have, a tenderness in the face of catastrophe. We found a partially restored journal of one of the humans. He wrote that if their bodies disappeared, let their sound remain. They believed that someday someone would hear. And now, we had heard. I thought I would feel triumph, but instead, I felt shame. We, The beings who considered ourselves superior found the music of those who vanished but were closer to life than we will ever be. As we left, I played the song's recording one more time, and the station echoed. It seemed as if Earth itself was whispering, "Remember." Before leaving, I stepped out of the ship and looked at the horizon, gray, silent, without a single spark. And yet, it seemed to me that somewhere deep within that ash, a heart was hidden that was still beating. Maybe not physically, but certainly in the memory of the universe. We took nothing with us but a copy of the signal. Our captain said that we must not interfere with the history of the dead, and perhaps he was right. But I know that one day someone else will hear this song. It will be strange, imperfect, trembling with time, and yet alive. And maybe then someone will understand. The universe does not forget those who once sang. I never believed I'd see living beings who would willingly fly out to look for a myth. Usually, all those stories about the high goals of science ended somewhere between a boring staff meeting and an emergency replacement of the oxygen filter. But when the council announced our mission to the ancient signal source, everything instantly felt like the start of a crazy adventure. And if someone had told me then that I would spend the next few months with a crew of scientists who could argue over the shape of a thermos, I wouldn't have believed it. Our team was a complete comedy. The commander, perpetually serious and certain he was born to save the universe, but constantly losing the airlock keys. The linguist, a fan of ancient languages who talked to the computer like a friend, assuring us it understood his mood. The historian, a convinced romantic, reading ancient Earth records and sighing as if nostalgic for a world he never lived in. And of course, the engineer, constantly arguing with me about whether the cooling system could be fixed with a teaspoon. I was just the observation operator, but everyone relied on me because, as the engineer put it, if anyone notices we're flying into an abyss, and it's you, you have the look of an anxious realist. The first few days, we flew in an atmosphere of cheerful panic. Everyone tried to act professional, but beneath the mask, everyone felt the same thing. We were flying to look for ghosts. An 8,000-year-old signal couldn't mean anything except that the civilization that sent it was long dead. But humans weren't just a civilization, they were a legend. We grew up on stories about them, a species that could dream, destroy, and sing all at once. Some considered them gods, others madmen. The linguist said humanity disappeared because they reached the limit of self-knowledge and couldn't endure it. The historian suggested they simply got tired, and I thought maybe they loved life too much to live forever. It sounded strange, but even their final signal was a song, not a warning, not a cry for help, but music. Who sings when they die? Only those who understand that sound can outlive flesh. We discussed this in the mess hall, pretending it was all just theory, but I saw it in everyone's eyes. They hoped to find someone, at least a trace. Then came the days when the fun stopped. Space doesn't forgive romantics. One of the navigation modules burned out, the air regeneration system was throwing errors, and our engineer didn't sleep for 3 days, cursing the universe, which, according to him, was intentionally setting traps for idiots. I started keeping logs, mostly to keep myself from going crazy from the silence. Sometimes we'd play that same song to remind ourselves why we were flying at all. And each time it sounded different. Sadness, then joy, then anxiety would surface in it. We argued whether it was an illusion or characteristics of the signal. The linguist insisted the song's structure was alive, as if it adapted to the listener. That's when I first thought that perhaps someone was listening to us too. The idea was insane, but deep down I felt we weren't just following the trail of a vanished species, we were becoming part of their history. Sometimes at night, when everyone was asleep, I'd catch faint oscillations in my headphones, snippets of a melody, like a sigh. I tried to convince myself it was just static noise, but the further we flew, the stronger the feeling became that the song was guiding us. At some point, I began to notice that we were all changing. The commander became calmer, as if realizing that not everything needed to be controlled. The historian stopped arguing, and instead of quoting the past, he started writing his own notes about the present. The linguist was silent more often, simply listening to space, as if trying to hear something that evaded the instruments. Even the engineer once said that the signal might not be a call, but an invitation. That's when I realized we could no longer be called mere explorers. We were pilgrims. Everyone wanted to find something personal. Me, proof that legends are real. The commander, meaning an endless duty. The historian, a history that could be finished. And when we finally entered the system where that signal was born, no one spoke a word. Everyone just stared out the viewport. Before us was the gray shadow of a planet, lifeless, lightless. But I swear, in that moment, the thought flashed through my mind. Maybe they are still here, not in body, but in sound, not as a being, but as an echo. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear the void itself singing. I don't know what seemed scarier to me at that moment, the silence of space itself, or how quickly I got used to it. When our expedition crossed the border of the colonized sector, I understood for the first time that there was no turning back. Until then, the journey felt almost like a tourist adventure. Training centers, preparation, official speeches, people shaking my hand and assuring me we were making history. But history, as it turned out, doesn't like witnesses. It likes those who can be squeezed, drained, tormented, and then, if there's anything left to tell, turned into a legend. I stared out the viewport and saw only cold darkness stitched with the faint lines of distant stars, and for the first time, I considered that we were flying to a place where no one was left, where everything had long died, and the only thing waiting for us ahead was a void that would swallow us whole. All this time, I kept a holographic fragment of that very song we caught at the edge of the galaxy in my pocket. I would play it every time I wanted to feel some connection with those who sent it, but it scared me more than it comforted me. I couldn't understand how humanity, which was capable of creating such music, could simply vanish. Our journey took months, but the sense of time had been erased. Every day turned into a rhythmic sequence: system diagnostics, reports, training, sleep. But beneath this external order, something much heavier was accumulating: tension that wouldn't dissipate. I felt the crew gradually shift into a zone of anxious silence. People stopped discussing the mission's objective. They pretended everything was under control, but I saw how sometimes one of them would stare blankly at a screen playing snippets of old Earth broadcasts, laughter, music, fragments of old news mentioning cities that no longer existed. Some believed we would find survivors, some that it was a trap. I, however, began to think that things had gone much more frighteningly, that human civilization had perished not suddenly, but consciously, leaving behind only cultural remains, as if they wanted the next to find Earth to receive not salvation, but a lesson. Sometimes I woke up at night in a cold sweat with the thought that the song we were listening to was not a plea for help, but a deathbed confession. The closer we flew to the region where we detected the initial signal, the stranger the equipment began to behave. Navigation instruments periodically gave errors, detecting non-existent objects in space. The radio system picked up noise resembling breathing and sometimes faintly audible words in a long-dead language. I tried to convince myself it was the influence of radiation and glitches from old interstellar networks, but my mind resisted. Why were the systems only going haywire here, near the signals from Earth? During one of my shifts, I was sitting in the navigation bay, trying to calibrate the antennas, when I suddenly realized that something outside the window had changed. It's impossible to explain with words. The darkness became different, dense, viscous, watching. For the first time since the mission began, I felt a fear that couldn't be dismissed as stress. I realized we were entering a zone where reason was a weak defense, where we would have to confront not only the mystery of vanished humanity, but also something that could make us doubt our sanity. And in that second, I understood. There was no turning back. We were held not by fuel or ship automation. We were held by the void itself, and it wasn't going to let us go. I remember the first step inside the station as clearly as my own name. It was the moment I first felt that human absence could be louder than any scream. There were no living beings in the corridors, no working ventilation, no blinking screens. Yet, the space seemed filled with pressure, as if the walls had absorbed someone else's fears and were now exhaling them back. I walked slowly, trying not to look at the documents scattered on the floor, the cracked photos on the walls, the abandoned personal items, because those were what hit hardest. An empty spot on a desk doesn't bother you, but a jacket forgotten on a chair hurts. I shouldn't have been thinking about this. The mission required composure, but the sensation of a foreign life still clung to me. I understood that this silence was not just the absence of sound. It was the consequence of something enormous. Something so powerful happened here that it interrupted not only the breathing of the people, but also the very essence of familiar reality. The station didn't look destroyed. There were no signs of struggle or hasty evacuation. Everything, on the contrary, looked as if life had stopped precisely on a single note. And that note, invisible and painful, was still ringing somewhere inside. I don't know what gave me the strangest feeling, the silence of space, or the fact that I quickly got used to it. I walked through the main hall and stopped at a large glass window that overlooked the station's inner courtyard. Snowy ash was scattered there, and the metal structures of the radar dishes stood as dark silhouettes against the gray sky. I couldn't figure out the source of this peculiar sensation, as if someone unseen was passing by, like their footsteps were overlapping mine in a delayed echo. Instruments registered nothing, no life forms. But instinct, that animal remnant of rational nature, told me otherwise. Even the air seemed too thick. I looked at the pressure panel and noticed something strange. The microatmospheric parameters showed small fluctuations, as if breathing processes were occurring in the room. But no one was breathing. No one could have breathed here for a long time. I looked again at the panel, then at the room, trying to find any explanation, but found none. I felt a presence, but it was neither human nor animal. It was something else. A trace of thought, an imprint of consciousness, the residual noise of long-vanished lives stuck in the space. I moved deeper into the station, where the archive sector was located. The corridors grew darker and the walls more covered in ice. It seemed the cold had penetrated here much earlier than the surface. I turned on my flashlight and moved on. The floor was crisscrossed with thin cracks, as if thermal shocks and deformation had been happening inside the station for a long time. I approached a heavy door with a sign designating the archive block. It wouldn't open. I had to manually connect power from a portable source and activate the emergency mechanism. When the door slid into the wall with a heavy sound, icy air blew out from inside, unnaturally cold. In the center of the room stood rows of shelves, neatly lined with cassettes, memory banks, and data crystals. Everything was untouched, no chaos, no panic. I felt my breathing quicken. I had found what I flew to a dying planet for. The information should be here. Answers, the stories of the civilization's final days. I picked up the first cassette, then another. I started reviewing the data via the portable terminal, but instead of visual files or recordings, I saw only black screens and intermittent noise streaks. Did everything break down over time, or did someone intentionally wipe the memory before vanishing? I began checking the archive by priority tags and quickly realized that all the data had been erased. More precisely, not completely destroyed, but overwritten with empty cycles. It looked like a job done deliberately, methodically. But I found something. In the far corner of the room, among the rows where outdated storage devices stood, there was a block with a handwritten label. It was screwed to the shelf with metal strips, as if someone was afraid it would be taken away. On the box, the words, "Do not erase," were written in shaky handwriting. I unscrewed the fasteners, turned on the device, and saw a single folder. It contained one file. Audio. 6 minutes and 19 seconds. I hit play. And inside the cold archive hall, that very song began to play. The one we heard in deep space. But the recording wasn't clean. Beneath the melody, a low noise could be heard, similar to breathing. And a second sound, as if someone was standing behind the person who was singing. And I realized that this station wasn't just transmitting the song into space. It was the place where it was recorded, and possibly the place where everything ended. I couldn't turn off that recording for a long time. Even when I realized I was listening to it repeatedly, my fingers wouldn't obey, as if someone was holding my hand on the control panel. The music was simple, humanly honest, without unnecessary embellishment, yet there was something frightening about it. I tried to understand why it had such an effect, as it contained neither aggression, darkness, nor a hint of threat. But the longer I listened, the stronger I felt that something else was hidden behind the melody, something I didn't yet understand. In some places, the sound trembled, as if the person recording was not just singing, but speaking to someone invisible nearby. And that invisible person was silent, waiting, and that anticipation sent shivers down my spine. It seemed the music wasn't just a song, it was an attempt to hold on, to cling to meaning at the moment. Meaning began to die. I don't know how long I sat in the archive, but when I stopped the recording, I was shaking, as if I had experienced someone else's pain that my mind was not ready to accept. When I got up and left the archive sector, the station's world had changed. Everything looked the same, but my perception was different. The silence was no longer empty. It stood in thick layers around me, filled with inaudible echoes of the past, footsteps, breathing, memories. It's impossible to explain logically, but it seemed to me that the station wasn't dead anymore. It was just waiting for someone to read its history. I stopped in the central hall. I needed to collect my thoughts, decide what to do next. I understood that the audio file was the key to the puzzle, but a key must lead to a door. Therefore, there must be a room, a place, or a device here that explains why the station continued to broadcast that song into space hundreds of years after the civilization's demise. And that meant I needed to find the main server node. Log files, or at least traces of the final actions of the station operator, might still be there. I moved toward it, feeling that every minute on this dying planet was beginning to change me from the inside. I arrived as an explorer, but was becoming a witness. And for some reason, that was starting to scare me the most. The path to the server compartment led through the lower technical levels. The further down I descended, the more noticeable the strange change in my body's state became. I felt pressure in my temples, a rapid heartbeat, as if the air was getting heavier. The indicators on my suit remained normal. The atmosphere analysis showed nothing dangerous. But inside, a feeling grew that I was invading a place I shouldn't have gone. Perhaps it was just fear. Perhaps exhaustion. But when I opened another hatch and found myself in the corridor leading to the server core, I understood. No, it wasn't an illusion. The entire station was covered in thin traces of frost, but here the walls were completely iced over, as if the freeze was coming from within. The metal surface was cracked, and cold energy seemed to leak out of these fissures. I walked forward with a sparse, barely alive light flickering overhead. At the end of the corridor was a door, around which a bluish-gray fog was gathering. I realized that the source of the anomaly was behind it, and I was ready to open it, but a doubt was already brewing inside. What if behind the door were not answers, but the thing that destroyed everything? The server room was a massive hall filled with rows of server towers receding into the depths. But the strangest thing was, they were running. It was impossible. The station's power should have run out ages ago, but I saw the faint beams of the diodes, heard the quiet hum of the deep modules. However, there was one more thing in here, far more terrifying. The room wasn't just cold, it was icy, like the surface of a comet. Ice covered everything, the floor, the walls, the servers, the cables. But it didn't look natural. It was smooth, thin, perfectly even, as if someone had created it intentionally. I walked between the server columns and saw something that made me stop. In the center of the hall stood an isolated device, a cryocapsule. Something was inside. And then I understood. The station was not just broadcasting a song into space. It was guarding the person who sang it. I approached the capsule as closely as the signaling cables and the frost-covered floor allowed. The dome's glass was fogged from the inside, but I saw a dark silhouette, a human one. It was then, for the first time during the entire mission, that I felt something inside me crack like the ice under my feet. I knew that humans had been extinct for thousands of years. This was established long before our flight. No recorded colonies, no surviving stations, no signals, only indirect traces of civilization, archives and artifacts scattered across cold planets and dead orbits. But now, I was looking at a capsule in which someone was either still alive or at least frozen in a moment between life and death. This was not a museum object, not a robot, not a trick. I saw the faint glow of biomonitors. The capsule was functional, and everything inside it continued to live. It was impossible to explain rationally, but I had to accept it as fact. The last human was before me. At first, I didn't understand the strange structure surrounding the capsule, rings of cables and vitreous ice, clinging tightly to the casing like a cocoon created by a machine or the station itself. I touched one of the lines, and a faint vibration ran through it. It wasn't electrical, but something else, as if it were a data transfer, but not digital. The word data didn't really fit what was happening. Everything looked as if the station wasn't just sustaining life inside the capsule, but communicating with the one inside, as if it were listening to his thoughts and responding to him. While trying to process what I saw, it became clear to me the servers around it were not just a control system, they were a neural network. Perhaps old, perhaps one of the early adaptive systems. But now it was different. It had evolved. It had been alone too long, connected to a single consciousness. And over time, it ceased to be a tool. It had become something more. I activated the capsule's external interface and gained access to the logs. The first lines shocked me. The cryosleep was connected not via a standard emergency rescue protocol, but via a manually assembled scheme. Someone from the station personnel loaded a person inside the capsule at the very moment the world began to crumble. The logs cut off at a single line. Memory preservation project initiated. I didn't immediately grasp the meaning of this phrase until I noticed a set of files on the server. An array of invisible neuromaps mounted over the standard systems. And then the understanding hit me. The station was not just sustaining the life of the last human. It was copying his consciousness, his memory, his emotions, his thoughts, and transmitting them into the universe. The song wasn't a random signal. It was part of the message, and not the only one. So, I had only heard a small fragment of the history the station was trying to convey to those who would find it centuries later. A heavy feeling washed over me, a mix of fear, respect, and helplessness. I imagined the final minutes of the people here. They understood that it was over. Pandemics, climate wars, infrastructure collapse, loss of control. But they did not want to vanish silently. They decided to leave themselves to the world. And if they couldn't preserve the body, they could preserve what was most important in it, the mind, the consciousness, the human part. Their mistake, perhaps, was that they did it too late. They didn't save themselves, but they tried to pass something valuable on to others. But why did none of them survive? Why was only one person in the capsule? Who was he? Why did he become the vessel for the memory of the human species? I searched the logs and gradually began to see snippets of information. The name had been deleted, but the description matched someone whom the people seemed to consider important. The one who wrote the last song. The one who became the voice of the vanished planet. As I looked at the dark silhouette beneath the glass, a thought came to my mind that I tried to dismiss, but it wouldn't leave. Maybe this wasn't even just the last human. Maybe it was Earth itself, compressed into one destiny, one heart, one memory. I wanted to open the capsule, to wake the one inside, but another fear began to awaken in me. What if I destroy everything by doing so? What would happen if I interfered with what the station had been doing for thousands of years? Maybe it held the person not only to preserve him, but also because without him, it would cease to exist itself. I realized if I make the wrong move, I might lose more than just a body. I might lose the voice of the planet, and then its story would disappear completely. I didn't immediately realize that I wasn't alone in the server room. Not physically, no other beings were nearby. But at some point, I felt that the station was watching me. Not as an automated system, not as a faceless structure, but as a mind that knew how to choose exactly what to observe and what to react to. I stood near the capsule, and something in the surrounding space changed. The silence became denser, the air heavier. The indicators on the control panel began to flash, although I hadn't touched anything. It didn't look like emergency activity or a technical fault. Rather, it seemed like a reaction. I realized it suddenly, as if someone had whispered directly into my consciousness. The station knows I'm here. It knows I saw the capsule. And now it is watching my every move. I wanted to retreat, but something greater than fear held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had reached the point of no return, and if I left now, I would never find the answers. And the answers were here. They were close. But to get them, I had to do the one thing I feared most: make contact. I connected my neuro interface to the station's local system. It was an insane move. Any security protocol would forbid attempting to connect one's own brain to an unknown network left behind by a civilization that vanished thousands of years ago. But I had a feeling that there was no other way to understand what was happening. The synchronization process began immediately. For a fraction of a second, I heard that same song, but this time, it wasn't coming from external speakers. It appeared inside me. I felt the station trying to reach out to me, but its thoughts were vague, like snippets of memory stuck between noise and silence. I saw flashes of images, corridors filled with people, a control panel where communication sectors winked out one by one, pieces of a destroyed city, flashes of fire, thick snow made of ash falling onto the ocean. These were not just memories. These were experienced events. And I realized they were not coming from the station. They originated from the capsule. The person inside was alive. He saw the world die. He knew the truth. The flow of images grew stronger, but resistance grew with it. Something was preventing a full connection. The station wasn't releasing the thoughts outward. It could broadcast music, phrases, individual signals into space, but it wouldn't allow anyone to touch the full memory of the person in the capsule. It was protecting him, or holding him captive. It was impossible to grasp immediately, but I began to feel the boundaries. The station wouldn't let me go deeper than it deemed necessary. I had to pass a test. I had to prove that I hadn't come to destroy what it had guarded for so long. It sounds strange, but at that moment, I began to realize that the station hadn't been just a machine for a very long time. It had become someone else, a custodian. Its will was rigid, but it wasn't hostile, more wary. It allowed me to see the past only as much as it considered safe, and I involuntarily recalled the myths of antiquity about dragons sitting on treasures. Only instead of gold, it was guarding consciousness, and it wouldn't let anyone near it. Yet, contact happened. In one instant, the flow of images disappeared, and silence fell. But it was no longer the deathly silence of an abandoned station. It was a deliberate pause. A new file appeared before me, right on the capsule interface. Unknown. It manifested right then, as if it had just been created. I opened it, and saw text. Not system logs, not command lines. It was a message, clearly handwritten. It was short and strangely simple. If you found this place, then memory is still alive. But memory is not life. Decide for yourself what you seek, answers or the truth. But know, there will be a price. I reread the lines several times. I didn't understand the difference between answers and the truth. I didn't understand who left these words, the person in the capsule or the station itself. But I understood the main thing. There was no going back. If I continued, I would unravel a history so vast that it could change not only my understanding of humans, it could change the notion of who we are at all. I always thought that worse than loneliness in space was the realization that the universe is not just empty, it remembers. And now, sitting before the console, where the phrase from the mysterious message flashed, I understood that this was not a dramatic thought from an old book or a quote from a failed philosopher. This feeling was so real that I could almost sense the station watching me from within its metal walls, as if evaluating, weighing, whether I was worthy to know what it was hiding. I had no plan. I had no crew to support me. I wasn't even certain that everything happening was real and not a side effect of sleep deprivation and chronic terminal stress. But the choice was before me: continue or leave. And the problem wasn't that leaving was difficult. The problem was that I couldn't anymore. Something too big, too important was hidden here, and it pulled me forward like the gravity of a black hole, not because I wanted to know it, but because not knowing it had become impossible. I decided to open the station's main archive. There was no regular entrance. It was hidden and tied to the biometric access of an unknown person. But given that the station allowed me to pass the first check, it might allow more. I enabled a manual access request and asked the station directly through the interface, not with words, with a data query. And for the first time, the station responded not with a refusal, but with a question. It sent me a line of code, asking for proof of intent. It was strange. The algorithm sounded almost like a moral evaluation. I needed to upload a part of my own memory into the system, a fragment of my personal experience. I realized the station was trying to know me, not as an engineer, not as a specialist or an intruder, but as a person. It needed to decide whether I could be trusted. I hesitated for a long time. Uploading a memory fragment meant complete vulnerability. I thought about uploading something neutral, but somehow understood it wouldn't work. The station would recognize the deception. I chose one of the most unpleasant but honest memories, how I lost a comrade during emergency repairs in the Proxima orbit. I made the wrong decision then, and it cost him his life. I thought it would break me. What actually broke me wasn't that, but the fact that I continued to live as if it should have happened. I uploaded that fragment, and the station accepted it. And for the first time, I felt it wasn't just a machine, it was empathizing. The archive didn't open immediately. Instead of data, another stream of images came to me. This time, everything was much clearer. I saw laboratories where prototypes of neurocores were being created, quantum-conscious storage units that were supposed to be the next step in evolution. The creators called it the Memory Project. Their idea was to preserve the human mind not after death, but instead of death, to preserve personality, feelings, knowledge, experience in their entirety. Immortality without mysticism, without magic, technology, not a miracle. But then, something went wrong. I saw the collapse of nations, mass riots. People tried to destroy the project, afraid that machines would replace them. But they didn't know the truth. The project was never meant to save humanity. It was an attempt to save at least a part of it, because someone already knew that the end was inevitable. I saw not a war, not a disaster, something greater. Something came from beyond the solar system, not ships, not a civilization. I couldn't understand what it was. It had no form. Rather, it was fields, waves, a phenomenon. It didn't attack. It simply altered everything it touched. Matter became soft. Space began to tremble. People disappeared without a trace. And then the Memory Project became the last hope. to save at least a few and send them outside the contaminated system. This station was one of those capsule ships, but only one capsule here is active, one soul inside. The others are empty. It was then that I grasped the main horror of the situation. Not in the destroyed Earth, not in the civilization's disappearance, not in the strange waves consuming matter. The worst thing was the realization that the person in the capsule is the last witness to humanity's demise. And he is still alive, not sleeping. He is not disconnected, he is simply trapped. His consciousness was cut off from the outside world, held by the station for safety. It was afraid to awaken him because it didn't know what he would do. But it couldn't disconnect him either, because that would be murder. So it guarded him like a sacred relic. And now, as I understood its motives, I felt a different kind of fear for the first time. I suddenly grasped the price of the choice mentioned in the message. If I continue and reach the truth, I will have to decide, wake this person up or leave him in silence on eternal guard. But I already knew that whatever decision I adhered to, there was no turning back. I never believed I would have to make a decision for all of humanity. It sounds too grand, too dramatic, too much like those old space novels I once read to keep from going crazy during long voyages. But here I was, standing before the capsule, the one, the only active one, where life pulsed. A person was inside it, the last human from the time of Earth, the last witness to the demise of civilization, the last thread connecting the past to the present. I looked at the transparent surface, behind which a silhouette was barely discernible, and it felt as if millions of years of history were weighing on me with an invisible burden. I knew that if I awakened him, the consequences would be irreversible. Too much time had passed. He might be unstable, dangerous, even destructive. But if I left him asleep, humanity's memory would vanish with him. I felt my hands shaking, even though the air in the compartment was motionless and dead, and my heart was pounding so hard that its echo resonated through the empty metal corridors of the station. I tried to imagine what any of the crew members would say to me if they were alive. I doubt they would have found the right answer. Someone would say, not to interfere, not to play God, because any intervention is too risky. Someone else would remind me that any life, even one, is a responsibility. And a third person would probably laugh and say that this was none of our business at all, that the past was already dead and should remain so. But I was alone, no captain, no engineer, no linguist, no pilot, just me and the station. And the strangest thing was that the station was silent. It seemed to be waiting. It didn't respond to any of my queries. It didn't guide me. It just watched. I suddenly realized it didn't want to influence my choice. It wanted this choice to be a human one, the last human choice. And that is why it entrusted it to me, not the best, not the most worthy, but simply the one who happened to be nearby. I didn't immediately decide to open the capsule. First, I tried to find any clues. I dove into the station's archives, reviewing fragments of memory left by the creators again and again. I searched for signs that the person inside was dangerous or that his consciousness was destroyed. But all I found was a voice. Not direct speech, but memories of a person respected even by those who disagreed with him. In one report, an engineer wrote that this person was the author of the main idea behind the memory project. In another, someone said that he refused to save only scientists or the wealthy. He wanted to preserve those who were capable of love and memory. He argued that history is not a collection of facts, but an emotional connection between generations. He said that if memory is cold and rational, it will die faster than flesh. He refused to be loaded into a capsule himself while there was a chance to save others. And only when it became clear that no one else would make it did he take his place here, not as a savior, as a custodian. Then I understood. There was no monster here, no madman. This was a man, and he made his choice. And now I had to make mine. I activated the wake-up sequence. The process began slowly. Life support blocks engaged one by one. Internal pressure equalized. The personality memory returned from the deep phase of conscious retention. I felt the station come alive with him. Systems lit up one after another, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment for a long time, but simultaneously, an alarm signal came through. Before this, I thought that the source of the ancient field that destroyed the solar system had long vanished. But I was wrong. It hadn't vanished. It had returned, and the station knew it. That's why it hurried. That's why it was waiting for someone like me, someone who would initiate the process. This wasn't just an attempt to awaken the last custodian, but to pass on what was left of humanity. The archive was too vast. It couldn't be kept on one station, but if the custodian was awakened, the mission could continue. And it was at this moment that I understood the true meaning of that phrase that appeared on the wall of the first compartment I entered. It wasn't a warning. It was a plea. Remember us. When the capsule opened, I didn't see anything imposing. An ordinary man, tired, weakened, with gray hair and deep wrinkles. But when he opened his eyes, I knew I had made the right choice. There was neither fear nor rage in his gaze, only sadness and gratitude. He asked nothing. He understood everything without words. He smiled the way people who have long since accepted everything smile. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need to know his name or his past. It was enough that he was human, which means not everything is lost. Even if the world is ruined, even if the universe is indifferent, even if there is only darkness ahead again, memory is alive. And as long as it is alive, we are alive too.